July 1st, 1097. Dawn. The plain outside Dorylaeum. 6,000 Seljuk horsemen sweep down from the hills. Arrows already in the air. The camp hasn't even sounded the alarm. 10,000 Crusaders, soldiers, pilgrims, priests, women, face the most lethal cavalry force in the world. Their main army is a full day's march away. There is no rescue coming. For 7 hours in chainmail under a July sun, the Norman and English knights of the First Crusade will face something no Western army has survived before. Then Bohemond gives an order that stuns every knight in the column. He tells them to get off their horses. But why? This is Dorylaeum. Welcome to Britain's history. Dorylaeum is where the First Crusade nearly died, and where Western warfare was changed forever. But to understand why Bohemond ordered his knights off their horses, we need to know what they were riding into. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into history, make sure you're subscribed. Let's go back to 1095, when Pope Urban II stood before a crowd at Clermont in France and gave the speech that changed the medieval world. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I had sent a desperate appeal to Rome. The Seljuk Turks had shattered his army at Manzikert in 1071 and swept across Anatolia. The road to Jerusalem, holiest city in Christendom, was in Muslim hands. Constantinople itself was within striking distance of Turkish cavalry. Urban's call generated a response that astonished everyone, including Urban himself. Across France, Normandy, the German states, England and Norman Italy, men of every rank took the cross. Some went from genuine religious conviction. Some went because a younger son had no inheritance waiting at home. Some went because debt or disgrace made staying worse than marching into the unknown. By 1096, the largest army Western Europe had assembled, in living memory, was moving east. Not one organised force but several columns, bound by the same destination, and precious little else. The military corps was formidable. Bohemond of Taranto was among the finest soldiers in Europe. A Norman lord from southern Italy who had spent his career fighting Byzantines and understood combined arms warfare at a level most of his peers did not. His nephew Tancred was aggressive and brilliant, and alongside them marched Robert Curthose, Duke of Normandy, eldest surviving son of William the Conqueror. Robert's presence meant something specific. He had mortgaged his entire duchy to his brother William Rufus, King of England, for 10,000 marks of silver to fund this expedition. He had bet everything on the crusade. With him came the Knights of Normandy and England, the professional military class that had conquered England 30 years earlier at Hastings. Men trained in the same hard school of disciplined heavy cavalry that had shattered Harold's army on that October afternoon in 1066. These were not enthusiastic volunteers. These were professionals. Among Robert's companions were figures whose names fill the chronicles: Odo of Bayeux, half-brother of the Conqueror; pagan Peveril, who would return from the Crusade to found one of England's baronial families; and Fulcher of Chartres, a priest who recorded everything he witnessed with the careful eye of a man who understood he was watching history happen. When the Crusade departed Nicaea on June 26, 1097, taking the former Seljuk capital after a siege, the army made a decision that nearly proved catastrophic. The column was too large to march as a single unit across the dry Anatolian plateau. Feeding and watering such a force required splitting into two groups: an advance column under Bohemond, including Robert Curthose and the Norman and English contingents, and a main body, a full day's march behind under Godfrey of Bouillon and Raymond of Toulouse. Kilij Arslan had been watching. His intelligence network had tracked the Crusaders since Nicaea, which he had lost to them, humiliatingly, after being caught away from the city, dealing with a rival. He had spent the weeks since building an alliance with the Danishman Turks, old enemies, because he understood that what was coming could not be stopped by any single Seljuk force alone, and he had chosen his ground with care. The valley near Dorylaeum, modern Eskişehir, was perfect. Open enough for cavalry to work, ringed by hills for concealment, bisected by the river Timbris, which would trap the Crusaders against the water if the opening assault drove them back. Bohemond's column made camp on the north bank of the river on the evening of June 30th. The ground looked defensible. The water was close. The surrounding countryside seemed quiet. It wasn't. The attack came at first light on July 1st, and it was unlike anything the Norman and English knights had ever encountered. Seljuk cavalry fought by a method that had no equivalent in Western European warfare. Their horsemen rode light and fast, armed with composite bows of extraordinary power, weapons that could drive an arrow through light armour at 200 yards. The tactic was not to charge and close with the enemy. The tactic was to approach fast, release a storm of arrows, and withdraw before the Crusaders could respond. Again, and again, and again. Fresh units rotated in as others fell back to rest and restocked their quivers. The killing was industrial, rhythmic, and relentless. For Bohemond's knights, this was a nightmare with no obvious answer. Every time they spurred their destriers forward to countercharge, the Turkish ponies simply turned and accelerated away. Lighter, faster, designed for exactly this kind of warfare. Any knight who broke from the formation to pursue was instantly surrounded by men who could shoot backwards in the saddle and cut down. The momentum of a Norman cavalry charge, the most feared military instrument in Western Europe, was completely useless against an enemy who refused to stand still and receive it. Within an hour, the camp was in chaos. Arrows fell everywhere, horses screamed. The unarmed pilgrims and servants who had no armour had nowhere to go. Casualties among the civilians were severe from the opening minutes. Kili Arslan was grinding the column down, breaking its spirit, killing its horses, waiting for the formation to fragment so his cavalry could ride through it. Then Bohemond gave the order that saved the crusade. He told every knight to dismount. In the culture of Norman warfare, this was a decision that cut against every instinct these men had. For a knight of the 11th century, fighting on foot was what happened when your horse was dead beneath you. Not a choice, not something you did voluntarily. The mounted knight was the prestige weapon of medieval warfare. To put them in a shield wall like Anglo-Saxon infantry was to reverse everything they understood about how battles were won. But Bohemond looked at what was happening around him and understood it with cold clarity. Mounted combat requires an enemy willing to be hit. The Turks were not willing. The knights climbed down from their saddles and formed a tight defensive perimeter around the camp, shields overlapping, spears forward, their full-length chainmail hauberks, their great kite shields, their iron helms, equipment designed for a different kind of fighting, became exactly the right tools for what they were now doing. The Turks' arrows hammered into the shields and spent themselves against the mail. Some found gaps at throats and wrists and thighs, and men fell, but the line held, and the Turks, watching their arrows achieve almost nothing against these formations, gave these men a name that the chronicles preserved across 7 centuries: Demir Adamlar, Iron Men. Robert Curthose and his Norman and English contingent held the right of the line. Fulcher of Chartres, who was there and saw it, records what happened when the line came closest to breaking. A concentrated Turkish push drove hard into the right flank, and men began to waver. Robert removed his helmet, exposing his face, making himself a visible target, making absolutely certain his men could see him, and shouted. The chronicles say the shout stopped the wavering. It is the kind of moment that no tactical manual can produce. The willingness of a commander to publicly accept the same risk as the men he is leading. The right flank closed. The push was absorbed. Throughout all of this, the women of the column did something that Fulcher of Chartres records with the matter-of-factness of a man who was there and understood what he was watching. Women moved back and forth between the defensive formation and the river during the fighting, carrying water to the knights on the line. In chainmail armour under a Turkish July sun, water was not a comfort. It was as necessary as the shields themselves. Without it, the Iron Men would have collapsed from heat exhaustion before Kili Arslan needed to break them by force. The women of the First Crusade, carrying buckets through an arrow-swept battlefield, were part of why the line held for 7 hours. The hours accumulated. Kili Arslan rotated his units with professional efficiency, keeping fresh bowmen cycling into range, while others rested and refilled their quivers. The marshy ground along the riverbank slowed any Turkish push toward the water, soft ground that heavier horses couldn't cross at speed. But the Turks tightened the circle regardless, reducing the space the Crusaders held, increasing the density of fire, waiting for the formation to crack. Bohemond had sent messengers from the first minutes of the attack, riding hard for the main column. 7 hours later, they had done their work. The first sign was a small group of knights, perhaps 50 men under Godfrey of Bouillon himself, who broke through the Turkish outer ring and reached the formation. Not enough to change the battle, but enough to confirm that the main army was coming. Then Raymond of Toulouse's Provençal troops hit the Turkish southern flank with a momentum of men who had been force marching for hours and arrived furious. And then Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy did something that the chronicles still celebrate. Adhemar was the Pope's personal representative on the crusade, a churchman and a diplomat whose role was ostensibly spiritual. But Adhemar had a soldier's eye for ground. While the main relief force engaged the Turkish flanks directly, he took his own contingent and rode them around the back of the hills, completely out of sight of the battle, circling wide around the Turkish position. He came up from the south, crossed the river, and emerged directly behind the Turkish camp. The camp went up in flames. For the Seljuk soldiers on the line, the psychology of the battle inverted in minutes. They had spent 7 hours as the besieging force, controlling the ground, choosing the range, dictating every term of the engagement. Now their own camp was burning behind them. Between them and safety stood a bishop with several hundred knights, and no interest in mercy. In front of them, the Iron Men who had absorbed everything they threw were now advancing, and the main Crusader force was hitting both flanks simultaneously. Kilij Arslan ordered withdrawal. It became something close to a rout. The Seljuk army abandoned the field and left behind everything in the camp: tents, horses, equipment, food, the Sultan's own treasury. Men who had been fighting for their lives since dawn found themselves standing in a captured camp full of gold and silver, the battle over almost before they realised it had been won. The reversal from near annihilation to decisive victory had taken less than an hour. The battle cost the crusade approximately 4,000 dead, the majority of them civilians and unarmed pilgrims cut down in the opening assault before the defensive line was established. Turkish casualties were roughly 3,000, plus the complete loss of their supplies and treasury. But the numbers are not the real measure of what happened at Dorylaeum. The real measure is what the battle prevented, and what it taught. Kilij Arslan never again offered open battle to the Crusaders in Anatolia. After Dorylaeum, his strategy shifted entirely to scorched earth, destroying wells, burning crops, trying to starve the column across the plateau. He had seen what disciplined Western infantry could absorb in a prepared defensive position, and he would not test it again. That decision shaped every engagement of the First Crusade that followed. For the Crusaders, Dorylaeum was an education written in blood. They had learned what Turkish cavalry could do, and they had learned how to survive it. The tight formation, the overlapping shields, the absolute refusal to break ranks and pursue. These became the tactical foundation of Crusader warfare in the Holy Land. At Antioch, at Ascalon, at the battles that would define the Crusader states for 2 centuries, the same principles held: absorb the arrow storm, maintain the line, wait for the moment when cavalry can be used with effect. Every Crusader commander who came after had Dorylaeum in his memory, whether he knew its name or not. Robert Curthose fought on through the grinding 7-month siege of Antioch and was there when Jerusalem fell in July 1099. He returned to Normandy to find his brother William Rufus dead in a hunting accident that was almost certainly no accident, and their youngest brother Henry sitting on the English throne. Robert invaded, lost, and spent the rest of his life as Henry's prisoner in Cardiff Castle, dying there in his late 70s after more than 20 years of captivity. The man who had removed his helmet under fire to steady his knights at Dorylaeum ended his days in a Welsh dungeon. History is not always kind to its best soldiers. Fulcher of Chartres, who had been there throughout, carrying water perhaps, or praying, or simply watching with a chronicler's eye, wrote his account of the First Crusade in the years that followed. His description of Dorylaeum has the texture of lived experience. The shock of the first assault, the terrible heat, the sound of arrows on iron, the moment the relief column appeared on the ridge. He records the women carrying water with the same calm certainty he uses to record the night's fighting. He was there, he saw all of it, and he wrote it down. The Plain of Dorylaeum is now the outskirts of Eskişehir, a modern Turkish industrial city. The river Timbra, the Porsuk, still flows through the valley, but the hills that Kili Arslan's horsemen descended are covered in roads and housing, and the ordinary activity of a modern city. There is no monument, no commemoration. Just the river and the fields where 7,000 men fought for 7 hours over the fate of the First Crusade. But what was established on that ground? That disciplined Western infantry could absorb the finest light cavalry in Asia? That the Iron Men could outlast what seemed like an inexhaustible arrow storm, shaped everything that followed. Every castle the Crusaders built in the Holy Land, every kingdom they established, every battle they won over the next 2 centuries traces back in some measure to the morning the line held at Dorylaeum. If this is the kind of history that moves you, the battles where Norman and English soldiers faced something completely new, adapted under fire, and found a way to win, then you know what to do. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told. Thank you for watching Britain's history, the battles that shaped a nation, told the way they deserve.